Alright guys, time for another video. So in the last video I talked about or made reference to the glycemic index, sugar intake, and fiber intake, and said I was going to talk about that in a future video, so that's what I'm going to talk about right now. What I want to start with first is the glycemic index. Now, if you don't know exactly what the glycemic index is, I will explain it for you. I actually pulled up the glycemicindex.com and we'll read off the description of what they say the glycemic index is. So, the glycemic index, or GI, is a ranking of carbohydrates on a scale from 0 to 100 according to the extent to which they raise blood sugar levels after eating. Foods with a high glycemic index are those which are rapidly digested and absorbed and result in marked fluctuations in blood sugar levels. Low GI foods, by virtue of their slow digestion and absorption, produce gradual raises in blood sugar and insulin levels and have proven benefits for health. So this is kind of where the idea comes from, that you have slow digesting carbs and fast digesting carbs. So something on the scale of 0 to 100 of the glycemic index, something that would be a slow digesting carb would be a whole grain like oatmeal, brown rice, really anything that would be considered a healthy carb by the traditional sense, where something that has a higher ranking on the glycemic index, closer to the 100, would be things like white bread, white rice, sugars, etc. Now, the problem with using the glycemic index to determine what foods you should eat for your diet is that the glycemic index of a carbohydrate is tested. It's testing just the carbohydrate. And how often when you're eating do you eat just a carbohydrate? Do you ever eat a meal that's just white rice, nothing on it, no vegetables, no protein, no fats? I don't know anyone that eats like that. So unless you eat like that, the glycemic index is pretty much insignificant. It's kind of complete bullshit. This is because the glycemic index of an actual meal is completely different than the glycemic index of a specific food. The amount of protein you have in a meal, the amount of fiber you have in a meal, and the fat sources you have in a meal all have a huge impact on the overall insulin response to a meal and how it affects your blood sugar. So the actual glycemic index of a specific carbohydrate really doesn't matter. So this might seem like kind of pointless information, but what you can take away from this and actually incorporate into your diet is that things like white rice, white bread, sugars, fruit, etc., they might have a high glycemic index, but that doesn't mean they're any worse than traditionally thought of as healthy carbs like whole grains, whole wheat pasta, whole wheat bread, oatmeal, brown rice, sweet potato. There's nothing wrong with eating these. I eat a lot of these, but you don't have to eat those as your carb sources. The big thing is the insulin response and raise in blood sugar after eating a meal can have an effect on your weight loss and fat storage, but if you're eating vegetables with your meal or some type of fiber, if you're eating protein and you're eating some fats with a meal, that's going to level out the spike in blood sugar. The only time this is significant is if, let's say, you're eating a pack of Skittles by itself. Yes, that's going to cause a big spike in blood sugar, and that's not what you want. But if you're eating a whole meal, having some sugar with that meal or more refined carbs is not really going to be an issue. This is kind of one of the reasons I suggest, other than all the micronutrients and meeting your fiber intake, is why I suggest having vegetables with every meal, because it kind of helps level out that spike in blood sugar from any refined carbs or sugars you might be having at that meal. So that's kind of why the whole idea of the glycemic index, or using the glycemic index to pick what carbs you should eat, is a load of bullshit. So that kind of brings me to my next point, which is sugar intake. So sugar is a high glycemic carb, but just because an individual sugar is high in the glycemic index doesn't mean it's necessarily going to cause this crazy spike in blood sugar. It's all in the context of what you're eating with it. So my best advice for sugar intake is, if you're going to eat a meal that's really high in sugar or refined carbs, eat that meal with other foods. Have protein with it, have something that's has a significant amount of fiber, fruits or vegetables, some whole grains with it, and also have some healthy fats with the meal, and that can kind of help level out that spike in blood sugar. I have personal experience with this myself. A good example is the meal I consume a lot of nights is generally a large bowl of the protein fluff I make, the recipe which I did a video for, and then along with that I have a very large amount of celery or some type of vegetable, and then my carb source is a bunch of cereal. And yes, this meal is relatively high in sugar because of all the cereal, but because the overall fiber intake in the meal usually has like 40 to 50 grams of fiber, 50 plus grams of protein, that kind of levels out the rise in blood sugar. I don't feel any negative effects of the significant amount of sugar, but if I were to just eat these sugary cereals by themselves with nothing else, I kind of feel like shit. So that's just an example of how to actually apply this information to your diet. If you're going to eat a lot of refined carbs or high sugar foods, have it with a whole meal, not just by itself. And you want to make sure you're getting plenty of fiber, not just overall, but try to get a significant source of fiber with each meal. This will also help keep your blood glucose levels relatively steady throughout the day. So the reason why the glycemic index seems to actually work for weight loss is this is only going to be applicable to people that do not track their intake. This is because if you're going to eat lower glycemic foods, you're going to be fuller with less calories, because lower glycemic foods generally have more volume and more fiber, and it's going to be a lot harder to eat in excess of those. Things like vegetables, brown rice, whole grains, oatmeal, it's a lot harder to overeat consuming things like that versus white rice, sugar, white bread. All those things that are high glycemic foods can actually increase your appetite and cause you to have more cravings, which in turn, if you're not actually tracking your intake, would lead to consuming more calories, which would lead to you gaining weight. It's all hitting your macros and calories in versus calories out. If you're not going to track your intake, maybe it would help to focus on lower glycemic foods, but I always suggest for everyone to track their intake. It's super easy now with all the apps. It just takes a couple clicks on your phone. Just track your food, and then you don't have to worry near as much about what type of carbs you're consuming. So that's about it on the glycemic index and sugar, but it was a topic I wanted to cover, something a little more in depth that I didn't really have time for in the previous videos. So that's it for this video. Hope you guys are liking the content, and if you want to keep up on future videos, don't forget to subscribe.